Ezekiel is the Old Testament version of the book of Revelation, and that helps us be able to interpret what Revelation is actually talking about. Ezekiel lived under the time of law, and it's important to notice that because Revelation is filled with all of these judgments that are actually found underneath the law. I'm going to do more video work on this subject after this video, but let me just show you a principle so that you can understand that when something is referenced from the law, it's specifically dealing with those who are under the law, which was Israel and Jerusalem. We read in Romans chapter 3, verse 19, that the things whatsoever the law saith, it saith to them who are under the law. Now that's a principle, and of course in Romans 3, he's applying the fact that everybody needs to be saved. But he's specifically taking Israel and Jews in mind when he's saying that, because he's quoting Old Testament verses that were only written to Israel that repeatedly state that they're all unrighteous and they're all undone. But by the same token, the judgments that are specifically stated under Old Covenant law are only for Old Covenant law people, the Jews and Israel. And those who rejected the New Testament in Jesus' day, and when I say the Jews, I'm talking about first century Jews. This isn't talking about Jews of every generation into our day. The first century Jews were the ones that had rejected Jesus, although many of them were saved. 3,000 on the day of Pentecost, 5,000 a few days later. In fact, the first 3.5 years of the church was all Jews. But now that we know that law is written to them that are under the law, and we're going to go to Ezekiel and show you a parallel, and Ezekiel was under the law, and you're going to see him directly name Jerusalem. Now, I want to say one more thing. By seeing how that Ezekiel refers to Israel and Jerusalem being judged with the same sequence of events that you find in the book of Revelation helps us understand Revelation is dealing with judgment upon Jerusalem and Israel. And you might say, well, no, that's the Old Testament that Ezekiel's talking about, and that would be upon Israel. Everything was about Israel in the Old Testament. But the book of Revelation is not that. Well, the book of Revelation is dealing with Old Covenant curses and judgments. But not only that, Jesus himself, just like Ezekiel, took things that were in Revelation and applied them to Jerusalem. Watch where he did this. In the book of Matthew, chapter 23 and verse 35, he says, upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth. Notice, all the righteous blood shed on the earth. He names the people to whom he is speaking in verse 37 when he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Well, lo and behold, you see the same thing in the book of Revelation and chapter 18, verse 24. In this harlot, in this whore that was killed, it says, was found the blood of prophets and saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. The blood of all slain on the earth. And Jesus said Jerusalem was guilty of the bloodshed all through the earth, from Abel right on to Zacharias, son of Barachias. And that's exactly what Ezekiel does. Let me show you one more thing that Jesus stated that was also referring directly to Jerusalem in his day. And that's in Luke 23 and verse 28. When Jesus was carrying his cross up to the mountain, while he was going there, a great company of people and women followed him, and they were bewailing him. But he turned to them and said, daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Why? Because the days are going to come in which they'll say, blessed are the barren, the wombs which never bare, and the paps which never gave suck. And look at this. He actually quotes the sixth seal in Revelation chapter 6 and applies it to the people of Jerusalem. They shall begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. You women of Jerusalem, you and your children, this is what you're going to cry. He wasn't talking about people thousands of years later. He was talking to them, just like he was talking to the Pharisees in his day, when he said, all the blood shed on the earth from Abel is required at your hand. Jerusalem, just like Revelation 18 and 24 said about the harlot. And here you see in Revelation chapter 6 that The sixth seal is going to include people crying to the mountains and the rocks to fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. And what's interesting is Jesus was being led like a lamb to the slaughter as a sacrifice. John even called him the Lamb who takes away the sins of the world. When these women were bewailing and when he spoke to them, you're going to cry for the rocks and mountains to fall. They were talking to the Lamb whose very wrath was going to cause them to cry out those words that he said they'd cry out that are in the sixth seal of Revelation. So when we see Ezekiel using the same judgments as Revelation, and it's naming Jerusalem and Israel, just like Jesus named Jerusalem and Israel, and I showed you two instances, we know this is interpreting Revelation for us. And let the Bible interpret the Bible for you, like we're doing in this lesson. So let's go and start with the very first thing that Ezekiel begins with in Ezekiel chapter 1, the throne vision. Now, in Ezekiel 1, he sees this whirlwind come out of the north, and it's got four living creatures: the face of a man, the lion, the ox, and the eagle. And when you drop way down to verse 26, there was a firmament over their heads, and there was a throne on this firmament, this solid mass. And the one that was sitting on the throne was like a man, the appearance of a man, and he had like amber from the appearance of his loins upward, and then from the appearance of his loins downward, fire. Well, Revelation chapter 1 shows us Jesus, and John sees him in this vision, and he makes this statement about what he looked like. He said, in the midst of the seven golden candlesticks, one like the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the foot, girt about the paps with a golden girdle. Like amber from the loins up, Jesus had gold about his chest. And then it talks about his feet. His feet were like fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace, just like Ezekiel saw him with fire from his loins downward. And then when you go to Revelation chapter 4, the very first thing John sees after the letters to the seven churches is a throne set in heaven, verse 2. And verse 7 tells us that there were four beasts with the faces of a lion, the calf, a man, and an eagle, just like in Ezekiel 1 with those four faces on the living creatures. These are called beasts. And then in Revelation 5, we see that God is on the throne, and it has a book written within and on the backside, and it was sealed with seven seals. And people are appealed to come and take that book and loose the seals. Well, in Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 9, we see Ezekiel sees a hand sent unto him, or reached out and extended to him, with a book inside of it, and he spread it before me. It was written within and without, just like Revelation, within and on the back side. So there you've got those elements that are common to both books. And then, since we're in Ezekiel, let's go to chapter 5, and let's look at the second verse. He talks about how he was commanded to take his hair and cut it off and cut it into three parts. And the third part he would burn with fire, a third part he would smite with a knife, and a third part scattered into the wind. And that represented what God was going to do to Jerusalem. And that's why verse 12 says, a third would die with the pestilence and famine, a third would fall by the sword, a third would scatter into all the wind. And Revelation chapter 6 talks about, of course, the four horsemen, or the four first seals, and it mentions the white horse going forth, conquering. You see this conquest going on. Conquering and to conquer. And then in verse 4, the red horse was war, bringing death to people with a great sword. And then the third horse in verse 5 is black, and it's talking about famine. And then the fourth horse was a pale horse, and death followed, killing with the sword, killing with hunger, death, and the beasts of the earth. You see the same plagues in Revelation that you find in Ezekiel, and Ezekiel is talking about Jerusalem and Israel. And then, since we're here in Revelation, let's stay in chapter 6. Let's drop down to verse 9, and he talks about souls underneath the altar that were slain, and they're told to wait until their fellow brethren would be killed like they were, until vengeance would come. But he's associating souls with an altar, and they're under the altar. And it's like an antithesis to this, where these are righteous people that were killed, but in Ezekiel chapter 6, verse 5, you see the sinful ones. I will lay the dead carcasses of your children of Israel before your idols, and I will scatter your bones round about your altars. And he's saying it, the children of Israel. These were all words spoken to Israel and Jerusalem in the book of Ezekiel. In fact, look at chapter 2. He said unto me, Son of man, I have sent thee to the children of Israel, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. This is judgment on Jerusalem that you're seeing in the book of Revelation, and Ezekiel's telling you that. It's interpreting it for you. And then the wrath of God is in Ezekiel chapter 7 and verses 3 and 4. He said, the end is come upon you. Now remember in verse 2, he's talking to Israel. I will send my anger upon you. This is the wrath of God. I will judge you according to your ways and recompense upon you all your abominations. My eye won't spare you. I won't have pity. I will recompense my ways unto you, and thine abominations shall be in the midst of thee, and you shall know that I am the Lord. Well, the wrath of God is also found in Revelation 6. And when you read from verses 12 to 17, that was the sixth seal that Jesus referred to. And it says at the end of it, the great day of his wrath is come. And in verse 16, the wrath of the Lamb. And then there's even the seal on foreheads of people in Ezekiel and Revelation. Revelation chapter 7 talks in verse 2 about an angel with the seal of the living God. And he cried to the four angels, and they were going to hurt the sea and the earth. And he said, don't hurt the earth and the sea till we have sealed the servants of God in their foreheads. So this seal was going to be like an indication to the angels, leave them alone when you come and judge. In Ezekiel chapter 9 and down in verse 4, the Lord said, go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem. This is judgment on Jerusalem. Put a mark on the foreheads of the men that sigh and cry for all the abominations that be done in the midst thereof. And somebody else would go after him and start smiting and wouldn't spare, but come not near any man upon whom is the mark. Just like the ones were protected in Revelation chapter 7 by the seal of God. And then in Ezekiel chapter 10, verse 2, you read about how that there's the coals of fire from between the cherubims that were to be scattered over the city. And this happened. He was told to go forth, and he went. And in verse 7, one cherub stretched forth his hand from between the cherubims unto the fire that was between the cherubims, and took thereon, and put it into the hands of him that was clothed with linen, who took it and went out. And he would scatter that and cause judgment to come on them. Well, the same picture is in Revelation. And that's chapter 8 and the 5th verse. And the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, cast it into the earth. Ezekiel said he cast it into the land of Israel. Earth and land are the same word in Greek, ga. It's earth and land. So he cast it into the land, and there were voices, thunderings, lightnings, and earthquake. And oh boy, do we ever have a lot to say about that in another video. Because you see this all through the book of Revelation. We've showed you 6 parallels between Revelation and the book of Ezekiel, with Ezekiel giving judgments for Jerusalem and Israel. And I'm going to show you in future videos how that these were all judgments that were under the law, strictly for people who are under the law and disobeying the law. And that can apply to nobody else but Israel. Israel in Old Covenant law was said that if you break this law, this is what's going to happen to you. And the law was a schoolmaster to bring them to Christ, according to Galatians chapter 3. The greatest way you could break the law is to completely reject Christ, because everything about the law was to bring them to Christ, and they reject him, and they crucify him, while committing adultery with Caesar in Rome, spiritually speaking. So that's 6 parallels. There's 14 more between Revelation and Ezekiel, and we're going to get into them in the next video. Stay posted.